Here's a question that sounds simple, but may not really be. What is behavior? Most people would probably say behavior is just what someone or something does, like a dog running, a person talking, a student studying, or a rat turning left in a maze. But in neuroscience, that answer is way too simple. Behavior isn't just movement, nor just muscles contracting, and it's not just the body doing something. Behavior is the visible edge of a much deeper system, a brain predicting, choosing, correcting, and trying to close the gap between where an organism is and where it needs to be within the environment. Before we talk about neurons, brain regions, or action potentials, we have to start here. What really is behavior? An important note to make: the brain does not exist in isolation. It exists to produce behavior. And if you do not understand what behavior actually is, you cannot really understand what the brain is for. So hopefully, by the end of this video, behavior is going to look a lot less simple. First, let's start with the most obvious part: what we can observe. At its most basic level, behavior involves movement, a dog running, a person speaking, a plant turning toward the light, an immune cell engulfing a pathogen. At the most reductive level, all of these can be thought of as outputs from a biological system responding to its environment. Crazy as this might sound, that definition is still not enough, because behavior is not just movement. Movement does vary in really important ways. It varies in speed, direction, strength, accuracy, complexity, and purpose. A reflex is movement. So is a symphony. But those are clearly not the same kind of thing, even if both involve the body doing something. That is where scientists had to refine the definition. One of the most important contributions came from psychologist Edward Tolman, who worked in the early 20th century. Tolman argued that behavior has several essential properties that separate it from simple movement. First, behavior is purposive. That means behavior is directed toward a goal. A rat navigating a maze is not just moving randomly. It is trying to get somewhere. There is direction in the action, even in animals we would not describe as fully conscious in the human sense. Second, behavior is cognitive. It is not just stimulus and response. Animals, and humans especially, build internal representations of the world, mental maps, expectations, models of what might happen next. Behavior is shaped by those internal models, not just by direct sensory input. Third, behavior operates at a molar level. That means it is best understood at the level of the whole action, not only by breaking it down into tiny pieces. When you reach for a glass of water, the meaningful unit of behavior is reaching for water. It is not just the individual muscles contracting or the thousands of neurons coordinating the motion. During my time in undergrad, my professor added 3 more properties that helped make this definition even stronger. The first is that behavior is flexible. It adapts to changing circumstances. The second is that behavior is adaptive. It helps the organism survive, function, and respond to the demands of its environment. And thirdly, behavior is anticipatory, which may be one of the most important parts. Behavior is not only reactive, it is predictive. The brain is constantly modeling the future and adjusting actions before outcomes even arrive. So here is the working definition we can carry through this series. Behavior is a purposive, cognitive, molar, flexible, adaptive, and anticipatory process. That is a lot more interesting than the way someone acts. Behavior is not a simple output. It is a complex, ongoing interaction between an organism and its environment. And this is where things get both philosophically interesting and practically important. There are 2 ways you can study behavior. You can ask how it happens. That is physiology, the mechanisms, the neurons, the chemicals, and the circuits. Or you can ask why it happens. That is psychology, the functions, the motivations, and the meanings. For a long time, these 2 fields often operated in isolation. Physiologists studied the machinery. psychologists studied the mind, and there was an assumption that eventually, if we understood the machinery well enough, the psychology would just fall out of it automatically. Now we know that assumption is incomplete. This is part of what philosophers call the body-mind problem, and it shows up in neuroscience as a real scientific challenge, not just an abstract debate. The brain is a physical object. It has cells, chemicals, electrical signals, and circuits. But behavior involves meaning, intention, and purpose. So how do you get from one to the other? One useful way neuroscience deals with this problem is through emergence. Emergence is the idea that higher-level properties, like purpose, cognition, and consciousness, can arise from lower-level physical processes without being fully explained away by them. The whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. Using our previous example, you cannot explain a symphony only by listing the frequencies of individual sound waves, and in the same way, you cannot fully explain behavior only by listing neurons and chemicals. Those details matter, but they are not the whole story. So if behavior is this complex, purposive, anticipatory process, what kind of system could possibly produce it? What does the brain actually need to be, mechanically, to generate the behaviors we observe? One of the most useful frameworks in neuroscience is the idea of the brain as a control system. A control system is any system that maintains a controlled variable within a desired range, even when the environment creates disturbances. For example, your home thermostat is a simple control system. It has a set point, the temperature you want. It has sensors, the thermometer. It has a mechanism, the heater or air conditioner, and it has feedback. Information about the current temperature that allows the system to adjust. The brain works in a similar way, but at an extraordinary level of complexity. It helps maintain variables like body temperature, blood sugar, hydration, safety, energy, pain, and even social connection within acceptable ranges. It senses deviations from those ranges. It triggers mechanisms to correct them, and it uses continuous feedback to know when to adjust, continue, or stop. What makes the brain remarkable as a control system is not just that it reacts, it predicts. The brain does not wait until you are dangerously dehydrated to make you thirsty. It models the future and initiates corrective behavior before the problem becomes critical. And here is the key idea: behavior is the output of a system trying to reduce the gap between where it is and where it needs to be. Drinking water, studying for an exam, avoiding danger, writing a novel, forming a friendship, all of these can be understood as actions that help close a gap between a current state and a desired state. That does not mean every behavior is perfectly rational. Obviously, it is not. But even irrational behavior can often be understood as the brain trying to regulate something: stress, uncertainty, social threat, boredom, hunger, fear, or the need for control. This brings us to a bigger question: why do brains exist at all? The evolutionary answer is surprisingly concrete. Brains exist because movement exists, and movement through a complex, unpredictable environment requires coordination. Plants can respond to their environment, and some even move in surprisingly complex ways. But plants do not move through the world the way animals do. Once an organism has to navigate, chase, avoid, choose, and coordinate fast movement, a nervous system becomes incredibly useful. That is what a nervous system does. It rapidly processes sensory information and generates organized motor responses. In simple terms, a brain is a system for coordinating behavior, and one of the most elegant principles in comparative neuroscience is this: the more complex the behavior, the more complex that brain is. A simple organism in a predictable environment can get by with a simple nervous system. But a mammal navigating a rich social world, planning for the future, learning from the past, and managing competing motivations needs a much more complex neural architecture. This is where a framework from ethologist Nicholas Tinbergen becomes incredibly useful. Tinbergen argued that to fully understand any behavior, you need to answer 4 different questions. 2 are ultimate questions. They ask about function and evolution. Why does this behavior exist? What problem does it help solve? How did it come to be over evolutionary time? 2 are proximate questions. They ask about mechanism and development. What physical processes produce this behavior right now? And how did those processes develop over this individual organism's lifetime? Most neuroscientists focus heavily on proximate causes, the mechanisms, the circuits, the neurotransmitters, and the cells. But Tinbergen's framework reminds us that mechanism without function is incomplete. The brain did not evolve randomly. Many neural systems were shaped by evolutionary pressures because they helped organisms solve behavioral problems, finding food, avoiding danger, reproducing, learning, regulating the body, and coordinating with others. Understanding what problem a neural system helps solve can help us understand what the machinery is actually doing. Now let's come back to Tolman, because one of his most important contributions came from a set of maze experiments that changed how scientists thought about what brains actually do. Tolman ran rats through mazes. That was standard for the era, but he added an important twist. Some rats were allowed to explore a maze freely with no reward at the end. They just wandered. By the standards of behaviorism at the time, this should not have produced meaningful learning. There was no reward, no reinforcement, nothing to stamp in a stimulus-response connection. But then, when Tolman introduced food at the end of the maze, those previously unrewarded rats solved it faster than rats who had never seen the maze before. The rats had learned during exploration. They just had not shown that learning yet. Tolman called this latent learning, learning that occurs without any immediate behavioral expression, stored internally and drawn on when it becomes useful. The mechanism he proposed was the cognitive map. The idea was that animals do not simply memorize chains of movements, they build internal spatial representations of their environment. The rat did not just memorize turn left, go straight, turn right. It built something like a map, and when it needed to navigate efficiently, it used that map. Later, neuroscience gave Tolman's idea a physical foothold. Researchers found place cells in the hippocampus, neurons that become active when an animal is in a specific location. So the map Tolman proposed was not just a metaphor. Parts of it appear to be reflected in real neural activity. That is a powerful example of behavioral theory predicting neuroscientific discovery. A psychologist studying behavior proposed an internal map before neuroscience could directly observe one. Decades later, researchers found neural activity that looked a lot like the kind of map Tolman had imagined. So let's pull all of this together. We started with a simple question: what is behavior? And we ended up somewhere much deeper. Behavior is not just movement. It is purposive, cognitive, molar, flexible, adaptive, and anticipatory. It emerges from a control system, the brain, that is constantly modeling the world, predicting the future, and generating actions to close the gap between the current state and a desired one. Brains exist because behavior requires coordination, and the more sophisticated the behavior an organism needs to produce, the more sophisticated the neural architecture required to produce it. And most importantly, to understand behavior, you need both the how and the why. Physiology without psychology is mechanism without meaning. Psychology without physiology is meaning without mechanism. The brain and the mind are not separate things. They are different levels of description of the same system. That duality is at the heart of neuroscience, and it is something we will keep returning to throughout this series. In the next episode, we go inside the brain itself. We will look at the cells that make it up, how they are organized, and how they communicate. Because before we can understand what the brain does, we need to understand what it is made of. If this was useful, please like and subscribe. Also, the rest of the series builds directly on what we covered today. Each episode adds another layer. And if you have questions about anything we went through, drop them in the comments. I will try to read them all and answer as many as I can.